The pristine walls of the mansion loomed before Sarah as she stood at the wrought iron gates, clutching her worn backpack, everything she owned packed inside. At 16, she'd cycled through more foster homes than she cared to count, but this was different. This wasn't just another temporary placement. This was supposed to be her forever home, or at least that's what Mr. Richardson had promised when he'd chosen to adopt her. "Welcome to your new home," he'd said with that perfect white smile, the kind that belonged in luxury car commercials. Standing there in his tailored suit, he looked every bit the successful businessman who'd made headlines for his charitable work. Single, wealthy, and seemingly determined to give a foster teen a second chance at life. It was the kind of story that made local news anchors tear up. But something felt off from the very beginning. Maybe it was the way the smile never quite reached his eyes, or how he'd specifically requested a teenage girl from her group home. The social workers had been too excited about placing a hard-to-adopt older teen to question his motives. After all, his background check was spotless, his references impeccable, and his bank account more than adequate to provide a comfortable life. The first few weeks seemed like a dream. Sarah had her own room bigger than any apartment she lived in, a closet full of new clothes, and a shiny laptop for schoolwork. Mr. Richardson was always polite, if somewhat distant, spending most of his time in his home office on important business calls. But she'd catch him watching her sometimes, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It started with small things, the careful questions about her friends at school, the tracking app he insisted on installing on her phone, for her safety, of course, the way he'd casually mention his connections with the local police department whenever she came home a few minutes late. All perfectly reasonable concerns from a protective parent, or so everyone said. But then came the mysterious meetings she wasn't supposed to know about. Heavy manila envelopes changing hands in his study late at night. The encrypted files she glimpsed on his computer screen when bringing him coffee. Photographs of girls who looked unsettlingly like her. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Sarah knew she should be grateful. Compared to some of her previous foster homes, life with Mr. Richardson was luxurious. She had everything she could materially want. So why couldn't she shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial? Why did his charitable image feel like a carefully constructed facade? Late one night, unable to sleep, Sarah heard voices from his study. Pressing her ear against the thick wooden door, she caught fragments of a conversation that made her blood run cold. The adoption was perfectly legal. No one will question. Everything's ready for Phase 2. Phase 2? What was Phase 1? That's when she started digging. Every night after Mr. Richardson went to bed, she'd sneak into his study, carefully documenting anything suspicious. She discovered offshore bank accounts, encrypted emails, and a pattern that stretched back years. Other girls, other adoptions, all fitting the same profile, all vanishing without a trace after their 18th birthdays. Now, 2 months into her new life, Sarah sits in her room, staring at her latest discovery, a hidden folder on Mr. Richardson's backup drive containing evidence of something far darker than she imagined. Her hands shake as she scrolls through the documents, each revelation worse than the last. She has two choices: confront the man who gave her everything, or run before she becomes another statistic in his carefully orchestrated plan. But Sarah isn't like the others. She survived too much to become another victim. As she hears Mr. Richardson's footsteps approaching her room, she quickly closes the laptop and makes a decision. She won't run, not yet. First, she needs to understand exactly what she stumbled into, and more importantly, how to stop it. Because somewhere out there, another girl might be dreaming of a wealthy savior, not knowing that sometimes rescue comes with hidden costs. What Mr. Richardson doesn't know is that Sarah has already set her own plan in motion. She's been keeping records, making copies, building a case. Tomorrow, she'll make her first move in a dangerous game of chess with a man who thinks he's already won. But tonight, she'll smile at her adoptive father and pretend she hasn't discovered his dark secret, all while knowing that the real story is just beginning. The next morning, Sarah went through her usual routine with practiced calm. Over breakfast, Mr. Richardson discussed her upcoming college applications, all to prestigious schools, naturally. His influence could open any door, He reminded her, as long as she continued to be a good girl. The phrase made her appetite vanish, but she forced herself to smile and nod. What he didn't know was that Sarah had already been in contact with Detective Lisa Chin, though not officially. The detective had been investigating a series of missing persons cases involving adopted teens, but could never find enough evidence to pursue them. Sarah had anonymously sent her some breadcrumbs, careful not to reveal too much too soon. She couldn't risk Mr. Richardson discovering her investigation before she had concrete proof. Between classes at her private school, Sarah pieced together more of the puzzle. Her research had revealed a pattern spanning nearly a decade. Every 2 years, Mr. Richardson would adopt a teenage girl, always from a different state, always with a similar profile: bright, resilient, but vulnerable. No family connections, no one who would ask too many questions. The school library had become her sanctuary, a place where she could dig through old newspaper archives without raising suspicion. That's where she found the article about Rachel Thompson, adopted in 2016, National Merit Scholar, accepted to Yale on a full scholarship, disappeared 3 months after her 18th birthday. The police investigation went nowhere. Mr. Richardson had been devastated, according to the papers, the grieving father who lost his daughter to the dangers of the world. Then there was Olivia Chen, no relation to the detective, class of 2018, another perfect student, another prestigious college acceptance, another mysterious disappearance. The pattern was undeniable, but the truth remained frustratingly out of reach. Each girl's disappearance had been carefully staged to look like they'd left on their own, withdrawing money from their accounts, leaving farewell notes, taking their passports. Sarah's own 18th birthday was just 8 months away. Whatever Mr. Richardson's endgame was, she knew she was running out of time. The pressure to maintain her facade was becoming unbearable. Every dinner conversation felt like walking through a minefield, every casual question potentially a test. Her one advantage was that Mr. Richardson underestimated her. He saw what he wanted to see: another grateful orphan, too naive to question her good fortune. He didn't know about the years she'd spent learning to read people, to survive by her wits. He hadn't discovered the burner phone hidden in her violin case or the encrypted email account she used to document everything. But lately, something had changed. Mr. Richardson's business calls were becoming more frequent, more urgent. Twice now, she'd overheard him mentioning a deadline and preparations. Last night, she'd seen him shredding documents in his study, something he'd never done before. Whatever phase 2 was, it seemed to be approaching faster than she'd anticipated. Sarah knew she was playing a dangerous game. One wrong move, one slip in her performance, and she might disappear sooner than planned. But she couldn't back down, not when she might be the only person who could expose the truth. As she sat in her last class of the day, watching the clock tick closer to another evening in that beautiful prison, Sarah realized she needed to accelerate her own plans. Because somewhere in that mansion, behind one of those perfectly painted walls, lay the evidence that would reveal Mr. Richardson's true motives, and she was running out of time to find it. That night changed everything. Sarah was finishing her homework when she heard the unfamiliar sound of a car pulling up to the mansion well past midnight. Carefully making her way to the window, she saw 3 men in dark suits entering through the side door, the entrance Mr. Richardson used for his most private meetings. Something about their rigid posture and calculated movements sent chills down her spine. She waited until the mansion fell silent before slipping out of her room. Years of navigating foster homes had taught her how to move without making a sound. The thick carpet muffled her footsteps as she crept toward Mr. Richardson's study. Voices drifted through the door, tense and urgent despite their hushed tones. "Everything needs to be moved forward," she heard Mr. Richardson say. "The Foundation's annual gala is in 3 weeks. Once the paperwork is finalized, we can proceed with the transfer." The word transfer made Sarah's heart skip a beat. She'd seen that word in the encrypted files, always appearing just before another girl disappeared. "The buyers are getting impatient," one of the men responded. "They're offering an additional 50% for early delivery." "Buyers?" Sarah pressed closer to the door, straining to hear more. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The conversation shifted to logistics, dates, locations, offshore accounts. Sarah recorded everything on her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she held it closer to the door. That's when she heard footsteps approaching from the other direction. Her heart nearly stopped. With nowhere else to hide, she slipped into the small alcove behind a heavy curtain, barely daring to breathe. Through the narrow gap, she watched as Mr. Richardson's personal assistant walked past, carrying a stack of documents. Sarah waited another agonizing minute before racing back to her room, her mind spinning with what she just discovered. The next morning, Mr. Richardson announced they'd be attending his foundation's gala together. "It's time to introduce you to society properly," he said over breakfast, studying her reaction carefully. "I've already ordered you a suitable dress." His smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did. Sarah spent the next week gathering evidence while pretending to be excited about the gala. She noticed more changes around the mansion: security cameras being upgraded, new locks installed, additional staff appearing with suspicious regularity. Mr. Richardson was preparing for something big. Late one afternoon, while supposedly working on a school project, Sarah finally managed to crack into one of the encrypted files she'd copied from Mr. Richardson's computer. What she found made her blood run cold: detailed dossiers on girls across the country, all matching her profile. Next to each name was a price tag and a status: delivered, in progress, or target acquired. Her own file was marked priority asset. The notes mentioned her high IQ, her adaptability, her lack of family connections, all the things that had supposedly made her a perfect candidate for adoption. But they also included details about potential buyers, transfer protocols, and something called Operation Clean Slate. Sarah knew she had to act fast. Detective Chen had warned her not to make any moves without solid evidence, but the gala was approaching quickly. Whatever Mr. Richardson had planned, it was clear she wouldn't have another chance after that night. As she sat at her desk, carefully copying the last of the files onto an encrypted drive, a shadow fell across her laptop. Her heart stopped as she heard Mr. Richardson's voice behind her. "Working late, sweetheart." Sarah forced herself not to slam the laptop shut, knowing any sudden movement would give her away. But as she turned to face her adoptive father, she saw something in his eyes that told her he already knew. The game was over, but whose game, and more importantly, who would win? Mr. Richardson's hand moved toward Sarah's laptop, but instead of closing it, he pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "You know," he said quietly, "I chose you because you were different from the others. Smarter, more resourceful." His calm demeanor was more terrifying than any anger could have been. "I'm not the only one investigating you," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She was buying time, trying to finish the file transfer without him noticing. Just 30 more seconds. A slight smile crossed his face. "You mean Detective Chen?" "Yes, I know all about your little correspondence." He leaned back, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. "What you don't know is that she's been working for me the whole time." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The detective who'd seemed so eager to help, who'd guided her investigation, it had all been a setup. Her mind raced through every conversation, every email, every piece of evidence she'd shared. "You see, Sarah, sometimes the best way to catch smart prey is to let them think they're the hunter." Mr. Richardson stood up and walked to the window. "Every move you made, every file you accessed, every contact you reached out to, it was all part of the plan." But something in his voice caught Sarah's attention, a slight tremor, almost imperceptible. She'd spent months studying this man, learning to read between his carefully chosen words. He was still hiding something. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then why did Detective Chen tell me about the offshore accounts in Singapore? The ones not even mentioned in your files." It was a complete bluff, but Sarah watched his reflection in the window carefully. For just a moment, his composure cracked. Sarah realized she'd stumbled onto something he hadn't anticipated. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. As he checked the message, she caught a glimpse of alarm in his eyes. "It seems we have an unexpected guest," he said, his voice tight. Through the window, Sarah saw a familiar car pulling up to the mansion, Detective Chen's vehicle, But she wasn't alone. 3 other unmarked police cars followed close behind. Mr. Richardson's hand moved to his desk drawer, but Sarah was faster. "Looking for this?" she asked, holding up a small key she'd photographed and replicated weeks ago. "I switched it this morning. The real one is somewhere safe, just like the evidence." His face darkened. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in. This goes far beyond what you imagine. I'm not the top of the chain, Sarah. I'm just a middleman in something much bigger." Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Mr. Richardson glanced at the door, then back at Sarah. "You think Detective Chen is your ally? You don't even know who she really works for. Sometimes, Sarah, the people trying to stop the monsters are worse than the monsters themselves." The doorknob turned. Sarah's finger hovered over the Enter key, ready to send the files to every contact in her encrypted network. But Mr. Richardson's words had planted a seed of doubt. What if he was telling the truth about Detective Chen? What if there was something even darker behind his operation? As the door began to open, Sarah realized she had seconds to make a decision that would change everything. Trust the detective who might be playing her, or the adoptive father who'd definitely been planning to betray her? Or was there a third option she hadn't considered, one that would expose them all? In that split second, Sarah made her choice. She pressed Enter, but not to send the files to her contacts. Instead, she activated a live stream, broadcasting everything happening in that room to hundreds of news outlets and law enforcement agencies simultaneously. If everyone was playing a double game, she'd force them all into the light. The door burst open. Detective Chen entered first, gun drawn, followed by a team of agents wearing FBI jackets. Mr. Richardson's face shifted from confidence to confusion, then to something Sarah hadn't seen before: fear. FBI. Everyone freeze. Detective Chen commanded, but her badge wasn't local police anymore. It was federal. She turned to Sarah with genuine respect in her eyes. "You can stop recording now. We've got everything we need." Mr. Richardson laughed, but it was hollow. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you've walked into." He reached for his phone, likely to alert his network, but Sarah had already thought of that. "The signal's being jammed," she said quietly. "Has been for the last hour. A little trick I learned from one of your own security contractors. Amazing what people will teach you when they think you're just a naive teenage girl." The FBI agents moved to secure Mr. Richardson, but he remained eerily calm. "Tell them, detective. Tell Sarah what happens to your witnesses once they've served their purpose. Tell her about the other girls who thought they were being rescued." Detective Chen holstered her weapon and turned to Sarah. "He's right about one thing. I haven't been completely honest with you, but not for the reasons he thinks." She pulled out her phone, showing Sarah a photo that made her gasp. It was Detective Chen, 15 years younger, standing in front of a mansion very similar to this one. "I was one of his first adoptees, the one that got away." Mr. Richardson's composure finally shattered. "Impossible. You were declared dead? Another statistic in your operation." Chen smiled grimly. "I've spent the last 15 years working to take down your entire network." Sarah wasn't just another victim. She was the key to everything. "We needed someone on the inside who could access your files without raising suspicion. Someone whose determination to uncover the truth would appear natural." Sarah's mind raced. "The anonymous tips I received were from other survivors," Chen finished. "We've been building this case for years, but we could never get enough evidence. Until you. Your live stream just exposed everything. Not just Richardson's operation, but every connection, every corrupt official, every offshore account. It's all being traced right now." But Mr. Richardson wasn't finished. Even in handcuffs, he managed one last smirk. "You still don't understand. This isn't over. The Foundation's gala is still happening, and you can't stop it without proof of what's really going on there." Sarah stepped forward, holding up a small silver pendant, the one Mr. Richardson had given her as a welcome to the family gift months ago. "You mean proof like every conversation you've had in this house for the past 3 months. That's the thing about predators. They never expect their prey to be smarter than them." The pendant had been recording everything. uploading encrypted files to a secure server every night. Sarah had discovered its potential during her late-night investigations and reprogrammed it using skills she'd learned in the coding classes Mr. Richardson had so generously paid for. As the FBI led Mr. Richardson away, Detective Chen turned to Sarah. "You know this isn't completely over. There will be trials, testimonies." "I know," Sarah interrupted, "but this time I won't be facing it alone." She looked around the mansion, the prison that had nearly become her tomb. "What happens now?" Detective Chen smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Now we find the others. There are more survivors out there, more girls like us, and they need to know that sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness isn't just exposing the truth, it's refusing to let fear win. As they walked out of the mansion together, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The nightmare was ending, but her story, their story, was just beginning. Because sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating monsters, but from preventing them from creating new victims. Behind them, the mansion stood silent, its secrets finally exposed to the light of day, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators hide behind the most charitable masks, and that the most powerful heroes can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. 6 months later, Sarah stood at a podium, facing a room full of survivors, law enforcement officials, and journalists. The trial had concluded yesterday, with Mr. Richardson and 32 members of his network receiving multiple life sentences. But this press conference wasn't about them. It was about the future. "When I first entered that mansion," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, "I thought I was alone. One girl against a system designed to silence people like me. But I was wrong. We were never alone." She gestured to Detective Chen, now Special Agent Chen, who sat in the front row alongside 5 other survivors they'd found and rescued. The investigation had revealed the true scope of the operation. The Foundation's charitable work had been a front for an international network targeting vulnerable youth. But for every dark secret uncovered, they'd also found stories of resistance and hope. Social workers who'd noticed patterns and kept records, teachers who'd maintained contact with disappeared students, small acts of defiance that, together, helped bring down the entire network. The Richardson Foundation's assets had been seized and reorganized under new leadership, a board consisting entirely of survivors and child advocacy experts. The mansion itself was being converted into a safe house and education center for at-risk youth, turning a symbol of exploitation into one of empowerment. "People keep asking me if I'm angry about what happened," Sarah continued, looking at the cameras broadcasting her speech nationwide. "The truth is, anger wasn't what got us through this. It was hope. Hope, and the understanding that sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to be the light you needed when you were in the dark." After the press conference, Sarah and Agent Chen walked through the mansion's renovated halls. The heavy curtains and security cameras were gone, replaced by large windows and artwork created by survivors. In the former study where Sarah had uncovered the truth, a group therapy session was in progress. "You know," Agent Chen said, pausing by a window overlooking the garden, "when I first recruited you for this operation, I wasn't sure you could handle it. But you did more than just survive, you changed everything." Sarah smiled, watching a group of teens planting flowers in what used to be Mr. Richardson's pristine lawn. "We all did. Every person who spoke up, every piece of evidence we gathered, every story we shared, it all mattered." Her phone buzzed with a message from her real adoptive family, the one she'd chosen after the trial. A loving couple who'd been fostering kids for 20 years, who understood the importance of healing and patience. They were waiting to take her to dinner to celebrate her acceptance into law school. "The story doesn't end here, does it?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Agent Chen shook her head. "As long as there are people trying to exploit vulnerable kids, we'll need voices to speak up and fight back. But now we have something we didn't have before, proof that they can be stopped, that one person's courage can inspire others to find their own." As they walked out of the mansion for the last time, Sarah thought about all the future residents who would find safety within these walls, the scared, brave souls who would discover, as she had, that their worth wasn't determined by their past or their pain, but by their capacity to turn trauma into triumph. Because in the end, the real story wasn't about a white millionaire's dark secrets or a black teen's quest for justice. It was about the power of truth, the strength of survivors, and the reminder that sometimes the most important families are the ones we build together, not the ones that try to buy us.